Here we are with another scripture discovery. We are now in Proverbs chapter 3. In this week's video, we are going through 35 verses, which is a lot to cover in one session. So instead of giving an intro and reading the passage over, I'm just going to jump right into the study of the passage. So make sure you read it over a couple of times on your own. It's important to be familiar with the passage before you start digging in and making observations and questions. Now, before we begin, let me remind you that this is Solomon writing, and he's writing it as if he's addressing his son. And we know Solomon's purpose for writing the Proverbs is for us to know wisdom, to be guided by it throughout our lives, that we may have a blessed life, and also to avoid the path that leads to death and destruction. All right, make sure you print out the passage, grab a pen or pencil and a few highlighters, and we'll begin with verse 1. Now it starts with my son, and then a command, do not forget my teaching. We'll highlight the command, do not forget. We'll also highlight teaching, and I think that's consistent with wisdom. And then we see a condition, but let your heart keep my commandments. So we'll mark that as a contrast, but notice that he doesn't necessarily give a command here. It starts with the word let, and we'll mark that. So this is more of an appeal that he's giving, and it's let your heart keep my commandments. I'm going to circle the word heart. We're going to see that word a couple more times in this passage. And the appeal is to keep my commandments. So I'm going to highlight keep and also commandments. Verse 2 starts with the word for length of days and years of life and peace, they will add to you. So what are they? It's referring back to his teaching and his commandments. So I'm going to point that back to those two words in verse 1. And this is the promise in verse 2, they will add to you. So I'm highlighting will add, and specifically what are they adding? Well, length of days, years of life, and peace. Now looking at verse 3, it starts with the word let. So again, it's written as an appeal, not necessarily as a direct command. Let not your steadfast love and faithfulness forsake you. Now, these are two attributes or qualities that we are called to have. I think I'm going to highlight those in bright yellow. Steadfast love, faithfulness, and we are to not let those two characteristics forsake us. So I'm going to highlight that word not and forsake you. But here's a command in verse 3. Bind them around your neck and write them on the tablet of your heart. So bind them is a command, and write them. And again, we see the word heart. Now, I think there's some parallelism going on between verses 1 and 3. They both use the word heart, and I'm going to make that connection. And notice that Solomon says, let your heart keep my commandments. And then in verse 3, write them on the tablet of your heart. And this reminds me of God giving Moses the 10 Commandments. If you remember, he wrote them on 2 stone tablets. And I'm wondering if Solomon has this in mind when he gives that command in verse 3 to write them on the tablet of your heart. Also, notice that verse 1 begins with a command and verse 3 ends with a command. I'm going to make that connection. And then in verse 1, it goes to the appeal, right? It starts with the word let, and verse 3 starts with the word let. So it's a command, then an appeal, and then a command. So there might be a little chiasm taking place. I don't know if it really means much, but it's interesting to see how he makes a connection between 1 and 3. And maybe that means we should look at verse 2. I think that's the blessing that comes when we do not forget the teaching and when we put the commandments within our heart. Length of days, years of life, and peace. All right, verse 4 starts with the word so, and I think it's referring back to verses 1 through 3. So you will find favor, and of course that's a promise. You will find favor and good success. And I like that it is in the sight of God and man. Now, verse 5 starts with the word trust. You are to trust in the Lord with all your heart. And the other command, do not lean on your own understanding. Again, we see the word heart. And I'm going to underline the word own, your own understanding. I think that will come up again. And then we see in verse 6, the call is to acknowledge him. So I'm going to highlight that. And I'm also going to mark the word all. In all your ways, acknowledge him. I think that's very convicting. And it points to the importance of acknowledging God in our everyday lives. When we wake up in the morning and all the various tasks that we do throughout our day, and when we lay our heads on our pillows at night. In all of our ways, no matter what they are, we are to acknowledge him. I'm also going to circle the word ways. Throughout the first 2 chapters, we've been circling the word ways and paths. Solomon likes the imagery of a journey, and we see it here in verse 6. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. So that's a promise, and we will circle the word paths. Verse 7, another command, be not wise in your own eyes. Again, I'm underlining the word own. Another command, fear the Lord. And also turn away from evil. I'll also highlight that word evil in red. And I am going to change the fear of the Lord to green. It is a command, but it's also unique. We've seen it twice in chapter 1. It comes up again in chapter 2. And now we see it again in chapter 3, verse 7. All right, moving along to verse 8. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. I'm going to mark that word it. And I think it's referring back to verse 7 and specifically fear the Lord. When we fear the Lord, it will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. I'm going to highlight it will be healing. This is the result of fearing the Lord, and also the word refreshment. I'm also going to underline the word flesh and bones. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. I think that represents in all that we are, we will be healed. All right, verse 9, another command. Honor the Lord. Notice that verse 5 is trust in the Lord, and verse 9 is honor the Lord. And we are to honor him with our wealth and with the first fruits of all our produce. So it's not just about our money, but it's also the materials that we have as well. Honor the Lord with your wealth and with the first fruits of all your produce. Then, I'm going to mark that word then, and I'm pointing it back to the command, honor. Your barns will be filled. They will be filled with plenty, and your vats will be bursting with wine. So barns will be filled with plenty, and vats bursting with wine. And it looks as though there's some parallelism between verses 9 and 10. Plenty is referring back to your wealth in verse 9, and wine referring back to first fruits. And this brings us to verse 11, starting with the phrase again, my son, and with another command, do not despise. Do not despise the Lord's discipline, or do not be weary of his reproof. Do not despise and be weary. I'm going to underline the Lord's discipline and reproof. All right, moving right along. For, and of course that is referring back to the 2 commands, do not despise and be weary. The Lord reproves him whom he loves. So I'm highlighting that phrase, the Lord reproves, and definitely underlining the phrase he loves. Those he loves, he reproves, and it's like, you see, this kind of love is being compared to a father who loves his son. As a father the son in whom he delights. And so we definitely want to underline that phrase, he delights. I think these are good words from Solomon. It's easy to despise discipline and to be wary of the Lord's reproof. That's easily the first reaction when we experience the Lord's discipline. But Solomon is giving us some hopeful words. He's giving us a reality check. Those the Lord reproves, he loves. And he loves us as a father delights in his son or daughter. So do we know that truth, that God delights in us and that it's out of love that he reproves? I think that is a big question we can ask as we reflect on verses 11 and 12. All right, this brings us to verse 13, and I think we see a little bit of a change. Verse 13 starts with the word blessed. Blessed is the one who finds wisdom. We'll highlight wisdom. And the one who gets understanding. So let's highlight understanding. Now I also want to circle this phrase, the one who finds, and also the one who gets. Here, Solomon is changing from addressing the son and specifically pointing him out in all these commands and all these blessings that come from these commands. He's using the word you and your throughout, but here in verse 13, he's generalizing. It's anyone who finds wisdom is blessed. He's not just referring to his son here. All right, in verse 14, for the gain from her is better than gain from silver. So this is pointing back to wisdom and understanding. And now I'd say specifically wisdom because this is how Solomon describes wisdom as a female. So in verse 14, for the gain from her is better than gain from silver, and her profit better than gold. I'm going to underline that phrase, better than. Better than gain from silver and better than gold. Verse 15, she is more precious than jewels. So I'm going to underline that phrase, more precious. And nothing you desire can compare with her. I'm going to underline that word nothing and can compare with her. Nothing can compare with her. And I think I'm going to make the connection between verses 14 and 15, where it's talking about silver in verse 14, and in verse 15 it's talking about jewels. And there's a slight change where it's talking about desire in verse 15 in the last phrase. And in verse 14, it's referring to gold. But I'm gonna make that connection as well. Verse 16, long life is in her right hand, and in her left hand are riches and honor. So I'm highlighting the phrase long life. That's a blessing. Also riches and honor. And remember, long life we saw in verse 2, where teaching and commandments will add to you length of days and years of life. Now verse 17, her ways are ways of pleasantness. I'm going to circle the word ways and highlight the word pleasantness. That is definitely a blessing for those who find wisdom. And all her paths are peace. I'll circle paths and highlight peace. So what are the blessings so far that we see? Verse 16 is long life, riches, honor, pleasantness, and peace. I would definitely see these as better than silver and gold and more precious than jewels. And anything that I can desire on this earth doesn't even compare to those types of blessings that come from wisdom. All right, verse 18. She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. I'm going to highlight that phrase, tree of life. And those who hold her fast are called blessed. I'll highlight that. And now I'm going to circle the phrase, those who lay hold, and also those who hold her fast. Again, in verse 18, Solomon is generalizing these blessings to anyone, those who find or get wisdom or lay hold of her or hold her fast. Which, again, you can see the parallelism between verses 13 and 18. In fact, I think I'm going to mark that. And the other thing we need to consider is that phrase, tree of life. Solomon may be pointing back to Genesis, where we find the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and also the tree of life. Solomon might be pointing back to that, especially when we consider verse 16 and that phrase, long life. In verse 2, it will be added to us length of days and years of life. And moving along to verse 19, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. We'll highlight wisdom and circle that word founded. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding, he established the heavens. Let's circle the word established. And in verse 20, by his knowledge, the deeps broke open. And we'll underline that phrase. And the clouds dropped down the dew. And we'll underline that phrase, clouds drop down. And so it looks like verse 20 is expanding on verse 19. It looks as though the deeps represent the earth and the clouds dropping down represents the heavens. And then in verse 21, Solomon starts again with the phrase, my son. This is the third time we see the phrase in this chapter. And then the command, do not lose sight, and specifically do not lose sight of these. So the question is, what are these? And let me circle that word. And there are two options. Number one, the word these can be pointing back to wisdom, understanding, and knowledge in verses 19 and 20. Or it can be pointing forward to wisdom and discretion. Let me highlight those words. And without getting into the Hebrew grammar, I'm suspecting that it is pointing back to wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. So I'm going to mark that. And here's the reason why. Look at verse 21 again. My son, do not lose sight of these. And then it's almost like he's repeating himself because he is giving a command again, and that is to keep. So let me highlight that. So if the word these was referring to what is coming ahead, which would be wisdom and discretion in verse 21, I don't think he would write it as a command. Now, of course, we could just say it's both, because it's referring to all the same things, right? It's referring basically to wisdom. But I do think he's referring back to verses 19 and 20. I think verse 19 is starting a new section. And if you go back to verses 13 through 18, you can see the pattern that I'm observing. For example, verse 13 starts with blessed, and it ends with blessed in verse 18. Let me go back up to verse 11 that starts with the phrase, my son, and some commands, do not despise and be wary. Verse 12 then continues with for, giving the reason why it is good to not despise and be wary of discipline and reproof. If we jump back up to the first verse, notice it's doing the same thing. It starts out with my son, giving a command, and then giving the reason in verse 2. My thoughts are verses 1 and 2 are parallel with verses 11 and 12. I guess I'll mark that. Again, this isn't the only way to structure this passage, but I'm just going by what I observe and what I've read without getting into commentaries and other study helps that we have accessible to us. All right, getting back to verse 22 now. And they will be life for your soul and adornment for your neck. They will be life and adornment. And of course, that word they, I'm going to circle. And I'll just point those back to wisdom and discretion. And I'm going to underline that phrase, your soul and your neck. Notice what Solomon is doing here. He's describing a spiritual truth. Wisdom and discretion will be life for your soul. And then he's giving an analogy that it's like an adornment for your neck. Again, Solomon using a lot of imagery. Verse 23 starts with the word then, and I think it points back to verse 22, that wisdom and discretion will be life and adornment. Because when wisdom is life for your soul, you will also walk on your way securely. We'll highlight you will walk and circle the word way, and we'll underline that word securely. That is a very comforting word. And I have this picture in my mind when I'm reading verses 22 and 23, especially that picture of wisdom and discretion being an adornment for your neck. And as you're walking down a road or a path where there may be robbers and thieves who want to kill, steal, and destroy, but they see this adornment on your neck that represents that you are God's, and therefore you are protected. I think that's a great image to think of when we read verses 22 and 23. And continuing on, your foot will not stumble. And maybe that's pointing back to securely. Your footing will be sure. It'll be secure. You won't fall into any snares or fall into any pits along the way. Again, I really like that imagery of someone walking down a path and the protection that we have when we walk along the path of wisdom. Anyways, moving on, verse 24, here's the condition. If you lie down, you will not be afraid. Let's highlight that phrase. And here Solomon is repeating himself just in a different way. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. So you will not be afraid, and your sleep will be sweet. Again, I think this is referring back to wisdom and understanding and knowledge in verses 19 and 20. This kind of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge that has founded and established the heavens and the earth is the foundation for the life for our souls and the adornment for our necks, the security that we have as we walk down the path of wisdom and knowledge. And it's because of this firm foundation that in verse 24, we will not be afraid and our sleep will be sweet. I think it's a picture of wisdom being a firm foundation that is secure and cannot be broken or corrupted. All right, moving on. Verse 25 starts with a command. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid of sudden terror or of the ruin of the wicked. I'm going to underline the phrase sudden terror and also the ruin of the wicked. And it's kind of interesting the similarities and differences between verses 24 and 25. When it comes to the word afraid, let me mark that. There's a connection there, but also it's a little bit different. In verse 24, it's a certainty, you will not be afraid, whereas in verse 25, it's a command, do not be afraid. I'm also going to mark that word when in verse 25. When it comes, I'm going to underline that phrase, it comes. Moving to verse 26, for the Lord will be your confidence. I'm going to mark the word for, and I think it's referring back to the command, do not be afraid, and the promise that the Lord will be your confidence. And we see the Lord will keep your foot. I'm going to mark the word from and underline being caught. Moving to verse 27, again a command, do not withhold good from those to whom it is due. I'm also going to mark the word when and the rest of the phrase, it is in your power to do it. I think I'm going to underline that. All right, I think I'm going to change the color of the line under those to whom it is due in verse 27. What I'm trying to do is point out the conditions in these commands. So we are not to be afraid of sudden terror or of the ruin of the wicked when it comes. And in verse 27, do not withhold good from those to whom it is do. So there may be occasions, or there may be some, whom it is not due, like those who break the law. So that's a condition. And here's the other condition: when it is in your power to do it. Verse 28, another command: do not say to your neighbor, go and come again, tomorrow I will give it. I'm going to underline that whole phrase. Again, we see a condition: when you have it with you. Verse 29, another command: do not plan evil against your neighbor. And here's the condition: who dwells trustingly beside you. Again, in verse 30, a command: do not contend with a man for no reason. And again, we see the word when he has done you no harm. And in verse 31, one final command: do not envy a man of violence. And another command: do not choose any of his ways. Let's make sure we circle the word ways. And this brings us to verse 32, starting with the word for. And I think that's referring back to the two commands: do not envy and do not choose. And he's talking about the man of violence and his ways. And he's calling this man, in verse 32, a devious person. I'm going to highlight that. I guess I'll highlight man of violence in red as well. Back in verse 32, the devious person is an abomination. That's a pretty strong statement. He's an abomination to the Lord. Here's a contrast: but the upright are in his confidence. All right, I'm going to pause there and point something out. Look at the parallel between verses 25 and 26 with verses 31 and 32. Verse 25 starts with the command, and then we see this huge list of commands. Verse 31 ends with those commands. You see that it begins with the wicked in verse 25. And let me highlight that red. And it ends with the man of violence in verse 31. We also see that verse 26 begins with the word for, referring back to do not be afraid. Verse 32 is doing the same thing, referring back to verse 31. And the other thing that I just noticed is the word confidence. Verse 26, for the Lord will be your confidence. Verse 32, but the upright are in his confidence. I'm going to make that connection. It seems to me that verse 25 and 26, let me mark that, and verses 31 and 32 are parallel, and I think it's one whole section, which means I think verses 19 through 24 is another section. And we already marked off verses 13 through 18, again starting with blessing and ending with blessing. And then this really long section, which we could probably break down, but I'm not going to do that now. But verses 1 through 12 seems to be one whole section. And it looks as though these commands are really driving it. Let me point them out really quick. Verse 1, do not forget. Verse 3, bind them and write them on the tablet of your heart. Verse 25, trust in the Lord and do not lean on your own understanding. Verse 6, acknowledge him. Verse 7, be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Verse 9, honor the Lord. Verse 11, my son, do not despise and be weary of reproof. And again, verse 1 starts with my son, and verse 11 starts with my son. So I think there's some parallels there as well. And now moving all the way to the end, here we are, verses 33 through 35. I'm thinking this is a summary of verses 1 through 32. Verse 33, the Lord curse is on the house of the wicked. I'm highlighting that word curse. This is God's judgment on those who are wicked. And let me highlight that. And I'm going to underline that phrase, house of the wicked. Remember in chapter 2, Solomon also talked about a house that the forbidden woman and the adulteress had. It's a house that sinks down to death. Here in verse 33, it's the house of the wicked. Then we see the contrast, but he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. I'm going to highlight he blesses the dwelling and also highlight the righteous. And I think I'll just point out the connection between house and dwelling, Solomon using the same metaphor. And then we see in verse 34, the scorners, God is scornful. And then another contrast, to the humble, he gives favor. And then in verse 35, the wise will inherit honor. And one more contrast, but fools get disgrace. Let me highlight the word fools, and they get disgrace. Now again, how I'm structuring this is not perfect. I'm seeing that verses 32 through 35 are very similar, and we may just even go up to verse 31. So we see the man of violence, 32 the devious person, 33 the wicked, 34 the scorner, and 35 the fool. In verse 32, that's where we see the beginning of a contrast, right? The devious person, but the upright, and we see the promise, are in his confidence. Verse 33, he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. Verse 34, the humble he gives favor. And verse 35, the wise inherit honor. So with that, feel free to structure this differently. But for me, this is helpful to understand the direction Solomon is going. I'm just going to bracket verses 33 through 35. Again, I'm just calling that the conclusion or the summary of chapter 3. Now, as we go back to the top, it's really interesting to see the different highlights that I have and the colors that I'm using, and I'm trying to be as consistent as possible. Of course, that's not perfect, but I think it helps us see what Solomon is emphasizing at some points in this chapter. Notice that he starts with wisdom words like teaching and commandments. There's a lot of promises or truth claims. When we do not forget teaching and commandments, there'll be length of days, years of life. They will be added to you. You will find favor and good success. Verse 6, he will make straight your paths. Verse 7, be not wise, fear the Lord, turn away. That will bring healing and refreshment. Honoring the Lord with wealth and first fruits will bring barns filled with plenty and vats of bursting wine. And it looks as though it repeats itself in verse 11 with my son and talks about discipline and reproof, similar words to wisdom. And it brings us down to verses 13 through 18 about those who are blessed. Again, it starts with wisdom and understanding. Verse 19 comes back with wisdom and understanding, knowledge. In verse 20, verse 21, wisdom and discretion. Verse 21 also starts with a command, do not lose sight and keep sound wisdom and discretion. And if we do these things, look at all the promises, all the blessings that come. They will be life for your soul, adornment for your neck. You will walk on your way securely in verse 23. Your foot will not stumble. Verse 24, you will not be afraid. Your sleep will be sweet. And then we have a list of commands in verses 25 through 31. All right, one more thing I want to take a look at before we end. I think I see another way to structure chapter 3, and it's with the phrase, my son, which then goes to a command. So verse 1, my son, do not forget my teaching. Verse 11, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline. And then in verse 21, my son, do not lose sight of these. So that might be another way of structuring it. You might want to play around with it a little bit and see how well that fits together. if that makes more sense, and in that structure there's a logical flow of thought, that just may be another way of structuring it. Again, feel free just to play around with that. And if you have questions or your own ideas and thoughts that you would like to share, we are having a Scripture Discovery Sunday School class at both campuses. At Sawyer, the Sunday school class will start at 9 a.m. down in the fellowship hall, and either Pastor Rob or our youth minister, Joe Kaler, will be leading that discussion. And I will be at Converge Community Church at 10 a.m. leading our Sunday school class. So feel free to go to either of those Sunday school classes. And with that, may God bless you in your continued study of the Proverbs. And we'll see you next time.